All right. I am here today with Cheri Hinckley on March 26th, 2019. And today, Cheri is going to tell me what it means to be a Californian. So, Cheri, where were you born?
I was born in Pasadena, California, which is in Southern California.
All right. And what was your family like growing up? And what was it like growing up in Pasadena?
All right, I actually was born in Pasadena, which is actually now Altadena. So I think it was maybe in a rural area. And then as Altadena grew up, because they changed the name of where I was born, little did I know until later. So I grew up in La Crescenta, and I consider that kind of a little bit of a rural kind of community, or undeveloped. There were no paved sidewalks, and we had a lot of freedom to run around the neighborhood. There were some lots that weren't built on, and we had big backyards. You know, we had a swing set and a big elm tree that we could climb, and it was kind of like, it was being in the city, but it felt kind of country like, and I really enjoyed growing up there. You know, the summers were hot. We ran around barefooted. We got stubbed toes all the time. Yeah, and there was no need to feel like we needed to be protected or babied, you know. It's like we were kicked out of the house, and it's like, it's summer, go play.
Yeah. And who is we? We is you and your brother Craig?
Yeah, but we had separate friends. I had a friend next door to us, and then she was a year younger. Then there was somebody a year older across the street. So we played together in different combinations.
Mm-hmm. And so when you were roughly in middle school, right, you moved up to San Mateo?
Yeah, actually not in middle school, when I was in the end of third grade.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
But I would also like to kind of mention, when I say this was kind of a little bit of a rural area, to me, at least it felt that way. I discovered a lot about nature there. You know, there was like a large form of Scotch broom that we used to call a camera plant, and we used to pull it back, and the pollen would shoot out, and we had a lantana bush that little moths would fly about. I used to capture them and study them, and then let them loose. And
well, Altadena and La Crescenta now are sort of, LA is sort of weird. It doesn't have suburbs in quite the same way as a lot of other cities. But this would be like suburban Los Angeles, but it's also in the foothills.
Right.
So it does have a more rural quality than most suburbs. Is that fair to say?
Right. And if you look up at the hills, you know, at the very top, you know, there is no houses at the top. In fact, I have memories of at least once of seeing a fire cresting, you know, at the top of the hill there. Mm-hmm. And the weather, was so hot. It seemed like we'd go to sleep at night and we'd hear fire engines all the time, you know, maybe for other kinds of fires. But we'd always have a swamp cooler in the window that would provide some respite, and I'd go to sleep at night with a cold washcloth on my forehead or on my neck. It was very hot, yeah. And no air conditioning.
And really quickly, just so we can establish a bit of a chronology here, you were born in 1950?
1949.
49, okay. Yeah. So this is the 50s in suburban California at this point.
Yeah,
That we're
yeah.
talking about. Okay.
Yeah.
Or suburban Los Angeles. Okay. So third grade, your dad had lost his job and he gets a new job up
Right,
here, right?
right.
Up in this area.
Well, they had struggled quite a bit anyway. I mean, he'd had a heart attack when I was really little, and that's when they bought their first house, and then we moved into this second house, and then he got laid off from his job, and we he had a friend up in the south of San Francisco who said, come on up, I'll get you a job. I've got a job for you here. So we moved, which was hard on everyone, but it was a job. So I lost a lot of my support down there because I had a family that I would spend a lot of time with, and my mom didn't want to move, but we moved, and then we ended up in the real suburbs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
In San Mateo,
I always
right?
equate suburbs as having paved sidewalks.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
We're in San Lorenzo right now, which is the definition of a suburb, and
Yeah.
those paved sidewalks. That was a defining feature of them when they were built, is that the sidewalks were paved. So that's a pretty kind of an accurate measure, I guess.
So I had a chance to kind of experience LA
Mm-hmm.
and then move up to Northern California, because you've got Southern California, which is really populated desert.
Mm-hmm.
Water brought in to for agriculture and houses and such, but it really most of it is really desert down there. And then up to Northern California.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was an interesting contrast. Yeah.
I want to backtrack just a little bit really quick. Your parents, did they meet in California? Did they meet else? They're both from the Midwest and they moved here together? How did they come to California?
Right. I don't know the whole story, but yeah, my mom was from Illinois and her family had a farm. She grew up on a farm. She used to ride, a horse to school.
Oh boy.
Yeah, and then she taught in a one-room schoolhouse when she was older. And a lot of those buildings are still there, the original homesteads. My father grew up in Michigan, in Jackson, Michigan, and his father started a bakery. He used to cook for some, I don't know, like a lumber company or something, the lumberjacks, and then he started his own business with baking, and then somebody in the family for the next four generations worked in the bakery, and that bakery still exists too. So anyway, my dad went into he went into selling. He went into sales. And he and my mom, and I can't remember the reason why they came out to California, but I think a lot of people were because they thought California was the promised land.
Mm-hmm.
The weather was nice, there were plenty of jobs, and I think maybe it might have even been the same person who offered him a job later on when he lost his job in LA. It could be that they were already out there, and my mom and dad kind of followed them. So and then he did sales. He was selling lawnmowers, and then and was very successful at sales because he had a very amiable personality, and then he had this major heart attack in his early 40s, and then he lost. He couldn't do sales anymore. Mm-hmm. And of course, as everybody was at that time, they were smokers. They didn't have any awareness of diet.
Sure.
And he'd grown up on bakery food, and anyway, he was and had the gene for a heart attack.
Right.
Yeah. So anyway, that's I think the idea that it was going to be a great place to live was what pulled them out.
Mm-hmm. And so your brother's a couple years older than you are.
Yeah.
And he was born in California too, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So they moved out.
Right.
I mean, did your dad serve in World War II, or did they?
No, he had a hernia, so
Oh.
he couldn't. I don't know why he didn't have it removed and go into World War II, but he decided not to have it removed so he wouldn't have to go into the war. Yeah, so basically, no, he didn't have to go in the war.
So do you know, was it after World War II that he moved out? Do you know when roughly, or?
Yeah, that's my brother was born in 47, and I don't know. They may have moved out, during the war.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Or at the very tail end of the war.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So, okay, skipping back ahead, you're in third grade, and it's time to move up north, and you guys settle in San Mateo, right? And so how was, you talked about it was hard for your mom. She'd built kind of a community of friends, and you as well. And so how was it different up in the Bay Area for you than in Southern California?
Well, yeah, it was a hard adjustment, and although it's interesting, I consider myself more of a Northern Californian than a Southern Californian, and yet I look so fondly back on all the years that I lived in LA, and I think the years that I spent in the suburbs of San Francisco and San Mateo they were tolerable, but they weren't particularly happy. I don't think I found my niche again until, I left home and went away to school and started traveling. Yeah, it just, I think I've always been attracted to the country, and so San Mateo just felt like it was full of boxy houses and malls.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So, so you're in San Mateo, and you, you do make a few friends who are still your friends now, right? Or Cheryl is.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I still have a friend that we went to school together. We went to middle school and high school together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then, so we discussed this briefly earlier. So you're coming of age in the late 60s, right? So you're right, kind of, almost on the crest of this, of like when civil rights really exploded, and anti-Vietnam protests and all this stuff. And so, you did mention you were a little bit of a late bloomer coming into those things, but how did that, how did growing up during that time affect you? Yeah,
it was, in some ways, was a little bit ahead of me. I mean, I used to go up, to Berkeley to check things out. I drive up there with a friend, and
high school.
Yeah, during high school, but I don't think things were really bustling yet up there. I never went into the Haight-Ashbury or, we did at one point, we would go to concerts at the Fillmore, and I'd usually go with my brother and his friends because they were older and they were a little more knowledgeable of the wild ways.
Sister tagging along.
Yeah, yeah. So,
well, your brother was maybe more involved in that stuff. He's a couple years older.
Yes.
And,
yeah.
Maybe as a more different personality than you.
Yeah, he was,
and a man. So, the draft came into play for him.
Which influenced him and influenced me quite a bit because, well, I was more the academic one. It's like I went to school and did my work and did my studies, and he was kind of more of the adventurer, and he didn't do well in school. He finally dropped out after 2 years of community college, and because the draft was breathing down his neck, he went north because he was ready to step across the border into Canada if his number came up, and then he ended up settling up there, and that was
where he still lives.
Yeah, pretty. Yeah,
in that area.
In that area, mm-hmm. And that was really influential for me because I just wanted to go visit and stay up there every summer because, he was out in the country. He had found a really sweet deal with a real estate agency that wanted some people to stay in this building in the country that the Diamond Bell Ranch, they called it, because they didn't want the locals coming up and breaking windows and doing things like that. So they wanted somebody living, mm-hmm. Living in it. So and
he was a groundskeeper.
So he went up with his girlfriend and a couple other people, and they were like homesteaders up there. Mm-hmm. So there was a lake in the front yard. They ended up staying, I think, 3 years, and they got horses and would cook their meals over a wood burning stove, and I just thought it was great, mm-hmm. that this country life that they had. And so I just wanted to go up every summer and spend time up there. And that's what I was missing kind of in San Mateo. And I really got a really good taste of it up in Washington.
Mm-hmm. And so he moved up basically as soon as high school was over, and so you were still in high school when you got to visit him in the summer?
No, he moved up after he had done 2 years of junior college, but I went to junior college because our family didn't have enough money, to send me away.
Which is an increasingly popular arrangement nowadays. I mean, that's.
Oh, yes. Yeah. To go to
it's pretty standard now, yeah.
Yes, yeah, because it's so expensive, even more expensive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so when I was in college, I was still living at home. Then I would just go up and visit him up there, and I kind of hooked up with one of his friends, and so we would travel. One year we traveled up there together, mm-hmm. and it was kind of a relaxed time, so we hitchhiked, to get there. Mm-hmm. It was all very adventuresome, mm-hmm. and kind of set the standard for me in a way for what would happen later for me, because I always keep coming back to California because I really liked California, but I would, go off on these different adventures and mm-hmm. and kind of come back home, I guess you could call it.
Mm-hmm. Well, and California is good for adventuring in itself.
But I took off to Alaska.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll get to that. So you go to 2 years of junior college.
Yeah.
And then you go to Davis right after that.
Right.
And you're a teacher, of course, so you did your teaching credential, but I've never asked you what you majored in college. Yeah,
so I got a degree in the science of food and textiles.
Oh, how have we never talked about this? All right, we'll come back to that later. So you get your teaching credential, and then after college, you join the Peace Corps and go to Morocco, or was Alaska first?
So I went to Alaska first. So I got my degree, I got my teaching credential, and then I had a friend, one of my roommates, said, we're a bunch of us are going up to Alaska. We're going to drive up the Alcan. And she had already been up there the year before.
Mm-hmm.
She said, why don't you come with us?
Mm-hmm.
And I had applied for some jobs. And then I went, yeah, that sounds like a good thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was 6 of us that drove up to Alaska on the Alcan.
Mm-hmm. And so this
highway.
is the early 70s? Mid 70s?
So that would have been early 70s. 72. That probably, I think that was 1972.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so you go up to Alaska for a few months, right?
I was there for 5 months actually.
Okay.
So what happened there was 3 women and 3 guys, and when we got to we drove up the Alcan Highway. At that time was not even paved. I believe it is now. And because anyway, we don't need to go into that. But the we came in at Fairbanks, and
Mm-hmm.
then one of the guys had a relative that lived in Fairbanks.
Okay.
So we watched the sunrise and set from what was a high rise, which was like 5 or 6 stories high. You couldn't build things too high because of the permafrost. But we were able to watch the sunrise and set because it never totally gets dark up there.
Right.
So it was fascinating. And so he was tending a bar, and he closed the bar down, and we stayed. It was just us that stayed. And then we took off and we drove down to the southern part of Alaska. It was either Seward or Homer, because I think maybe it was Homer. There were ferries that would take us to Kodiak, and I don't know how or why we decided on going to Kodiak, but the boys got on a boat, to fish, and we went down and worked in the canneries. Mm-hmm. And so the 3 of us, and my friend Meg and I, she had a tent, and so we stayed out in the forest in the tent. And then now I don't even remember why we didn't even think there's these huge bears there, Kodiak bears, but that didn't seem to bother us. Then we'd hitchhike into town to work at the cannery.
You hitchhiked every day?
Every day.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And because we didn't have a vehicle. And
I can't imagine hitchhiking to work.
Yeah. I don't even...
Let alone hitchhiking to work is, that's a whole different...
Yeah. And I was thinking, well, couldn't even been that much traffic, on these kind of side roads. But yeah, so we would work in the cannery. All right, and now we made what we thought was pretty good money.
Uh-huh.
At that time, it looked like great money, $2.99 an hour, and it was kind of boring work, but it was an adventure. And after working,
so the motivation to go do this was to just kind of go, just because you could, just going on an adventure.
Well, to also
there's a little bit of wilderness involved.
Something that would pay for the adventure also. So It was like, that's how I've always done it. It's like work while I'm traveling, and then it pays for itself. Mm-hmm. So, I had money to live on. And then I took off at a certain point. One of the women, Lori, took off, and she went over to Seward. And then I think Meg stayed, and then I went camping. I left and went up to Denali to do a little camping trip. Mm-hmm. And then I came back, and then it was king crab season. And then we made more money. Mm-hmm. Then it was like $3.99 an hour or something. And overtime, time and a half, big money.
Oh, wow.
And but unfortunately, I wasn't able to cash in on that too much, because I think I only was able to work maybe 3 weeks of that. But it was fun and intense, and I just remembered just the wonderful seafood that I ate, because people that I knew would, bring seafood back in and give it to us. At this time, we were staying in the dorm, and
so they had like a dorm for seasonal workers, or
yeah, because Meg, I think at that point she took off and went back to the mainland, and so I didn't have the tent.
Mm-hmm.
And then I slept, in the dorm and paid for that. And then we had the kitchen to cook, so we had all the king crab fresh, that we could eat. It was like, that part of it was paradise. The weather was getting very cold. Very extreme weather happens up there, and one of my friends, and I can't remember now whether it was a joke or whether she really did it, but she was smaller than I am in terms of her body type, and she was kind of short. She would carry a rock around with her because the winds were so intense. And now I can't remember whether she did that to give herself really some extra weight or whether she was just joking around. But the winds were really strong, mm-hmm. and you could be knocked over by mm-hmm. them. So anyway, I finished that season, then started working shrimp again, and one of my friends had decided that she was going to buy the health food store in town, and wanted to know if I wanted to do that with her. And I thought about it, but then I thought, California has much better weather than Alaska. Alaska is very hard in the winter. Mm-hmm. And my friends, Meg and Lori, stayed with their boyfriends, and they stayed the winter, and it was extremely hard. I flew back and met up with my brother, and we went home for the holidays. Mm-hmm. And didn't go back to Alaska for, I don't know, maybe another 15 years. Mm. And went back and visited some friends there that Jim had made. So this was not friends of mine that had stayed. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so anyway, that was a great adventure. And then when I came back, I want to continue with my adventuring, and so I collected unemployment for a while and applied to the Department of Interior to go up to the northernmost part of Alaska and teach the little native children up there. Mm-hmm. And I thought, I'll get a husky, and anyway, my application was rejected. At that time, they weren't accepting single women. They said the life's too hard. And not too long after that, they changed their policy. But in the meantime, then I applied to the Peace Corps and landed a job in Morocco. So, and now Morocco, interestingly enough, is
sort of opposite of your original plan.
Yeah, and the culture, of course, was extremely different. But the weather and the variety of weather and the type of, what do I want to say, the land, the mountains, the desert, the valley, all very similar in a way to California.
Okay.
Yeah, very similar.
Well, it's on the Mediterranean, I suppose. So
yeah. So milder on the northern part, some medium mountains, some high mountains. Agriculture. I don't know. It was a beautiful country and an incredible experience. Mm-hmm. And I stayed for 2 years. Then I almost stayed another year, and I had worked with children there, and then I was going to maybe teach English, and then I thought, no, it's time to kind of uncover again my California, my American
touch base with home
personality. You know, it's like there were people who stayed there. They married people. Moroccans, they landed jobs in administration with the Peace Corps, and they made a life out of that. But, I decided it was time to go home. So,
so you go on a couple of pretty exciting adventures, and you come back to California, Northern California. And so what did you kind of bring back with you from those experiences? What's the next? You come back and you meet your now husband pretty soon after, right?
Right. Within I think I came back in June, and I met Jim in August. So
very quick.
It happened pretty fast.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's a good question of how my experience over there, how that enhanced my life or switched, my direction. I think some of the things that I appreciated most about Morocco was how close to the earth people live there, and their eating routines, how they collected things in the wild. All of that was just really lovely to me, So it's like every morning they would wake up. It did not matter what your economic status was. Bread was made, and then it was taken to the local faran, which is the local oven. And they would know, and I can't remember how and why they knew whose belonged to who, but somehow or another bread never got mixed up.
Wow.
And, they would take one of those long sticks with a paddle at the end and put it into the oven, bake it, and you'd come back later and pick it up and it would be warm. And you did so much with your hands there. You tear off pieces of bread and dip it in the olive oil. And they always had really good olive oil because they grew tons of olive trees there. Mm-hmm. And, if it was a main dish with meat and vegetables in it, you still would have the bread, and that would be your spoon. You would scoop up, or soak up, the juices with the bread, and then you'd pop it in your mouth. And then they had couscous too, which was a grain, like a semolina, and it could be in various sizes because they could build it up into slightly larger balls. Mm-hmm. And it would be steamed and fluffed up and steamed and fluffed up, and then you'd have just all kinds of different ways to make the base. So then they'd make a big mound of this steamed semolina, and then they would put the meat around it and the vegetables on top, and then everybody would just dig into it with their hands, mm-hmm. And make a ball, mm-hmm. and then pop it into their mouth. Mm-hmm. So it was like, it was just fascinating. Mm-hmm. It was so great. So all people generally did not have spoons, and I'm trying to think, because if they were breaking the fast for Ramadan, we did have soup in big bowls, and I can't remember whether we used spoons for that or whether we just drank it, because it was really a very thick soup, but I can't remember on that. We might have used spoons for that. So generally, there was no need to have your own plate, your own, you did have your own bowl for the soup, but the bread generally was...
You just have your own bread, and then you're ready to go.
Yeah. And the bread was fresh because it was like every day they would bake the bread, And
so is there, it sounds to me like there was definitely, there was a communal aspect that, we, on another level that we as Americans don't typically experience. that you got to experience in Morocco.
Yeah, it was. It was a very community, family oriented
Tight
culture. Yeah.
Okay. So you have that experience, and you come back to California, to Northern California, and you say you have such fond memories of Southern California. Did you just come back to Northern California because you had family here, or was that a very conscious decision? Because you've gone all over the world at this point, so you could have just gone back to Southern California. Why not?
Yeah, no, and I think Davis was kind of my home base, really, at this point. And I did come back because I did have family. My mom and dad were still there. So, and since my brother was up in Washington, I think I felt a pull, one of Davis and my friends from college and my family, that to come back to that area. But when I was in Davis, I really enjoyed Davis, and once again the hot weather that was there, and I had like a big garden. I always would make a garden wherever I was living, or continued a garden that somebody else had started. Anyway, so I actually went back to Davis thinking I might settle in there when I came back, and my friend Sarah and I had kind of plans that we'd share a house together, and then she said, you know what, I don't think, on second thought, I really don't think it's a good idea, because I am going to be working so hard, going to law school, and you're going to have a job with no big responsibilities, or no. And so
you're going to be going through pretty different experiences.
Yeah. She says, I won't be fun to live with. I'm going to have my nose to the grindstone. So I went down to Berkeley. Yeah, so I moved down to Berkeley and got in touch with my friend that had Cheryl, who had been my friend since middle school, and she was house sitting. So we did a number of house sitting jobs for the next 6 months maybe. And during that time I was hanging out with Jim. And I was trying to figure out what direction I was going to go in, but I kind of was enjoying living in Berkeley. There was a lot going on there.
And hold on, we need to tell a brief version of the story of how you met Jim, because it's a pretty fantastic story.
So Jim was actually painting a flat. And there was 3 of us, Cheryl, me, and somebody she was going to school with, Leo. And we were trying to find a place to rent. Our house sitting jobs were running out. And we saw this guy painting, and we had tried lots of other ways to find housing, and we're not very successful. And then we were just driving the streets, and there was this guy painting. And so we thought, well, if he's painting, they're probably getting it ready for renters. So let's see if it's happened yet. And so he put us in touch with the owner, and I had a long interview with the owner, and we ended up with the place. And we started socializing with Jim, and one night I had made a big Moroccan dinner for some people who had been in Morocco with me, and they canceled at the last minute, and I'd made just an incredible spread. And I even had the table set up on the floor and the pillows, and just like they would eat in Morocco. And so I called Jim up and asked if he wanted to come over and have dinner. anyway, he said, sure, of course. And then I think he thought, this must be some message from, the gods, this, because he didn't have a lot of money at that time. And then there was this incredible spread in front of him. And he just, well, that was it.
Mm-hmm.
That was the beginning of a longer relationship. Yeah.
Sure. All right. So, you continue to date Jim. Eventually, you guys get married, and so you go into teaching at this time. You finally get around to it.
Yeah, because I had some serving jobs. I worked at an Italian restaurant for a year, and I substituted a little bit, and then I started applying, for jobs, and then I landed a job in a private school that was very nature oriented. It was a perfect fit for me, and it was a school that had a small classroom size and called for a lot of field trips, to nature zones and overnight campouts and, studying animal life. Yeah, so it was a perfect fit for me. And I worked there for actually almost 19 years. And then Jim decided, well, during that time, our son was conceived and born, and Jim went back to school and got his teaching credential. So we both had our credential at that point. And then we pretty much settled in. I had lived in a lot of different places, and Jim had been in one place for quite a while, and I moved into that little cottage with him, and then we expanded and moved into a house that we eventually bought, and decided that Berkeley, Oakland was a good fit for us.
Mm-hmm. So just to get back in touch with our chronology here, your son, and full disclosure, her son is my husband. So, so Michael was born in 1985, and you're living in this little cottage when he's born, and then you move. And this is in like North Oakland near the Berkeley border, and you move a few blocks away, basically, right? Kind of almost in the same neighborhood to the house that you end up buying, which you still live in today.
Right.
And so this is a nice little...
Well, we actually moved to one other house that was just 2 houses away from the cottage.
Mm.
And it had like a big yard with a weeping willow. Jim hung a swing from it. We had a big garden there. And that worked out really nicely until the landlord decided he wanted to move back into the house. So then we found this other house that was next door to a really close friend. And that's where we ended up staying.
Mm-hmm. And nature is definitely a big part of your relationship with Jim still. And so how in this period between meeting him and before Michael was born, were you guys such avid campers still at that time?
Oh yeah. We would, every chance we would get, we would go camping. Basically, we spent a lot of time on the coast, going up into Mendocino, and we did some backpacking trips. One memorable one up into the Trinity Alps in Northern California, and went down to the desert, and we just we got out a lot. And Jim has always been a fossil hunter, but a lot of those trips until we went to Nevada, where there was much better fossils, then we just did a lot of camping and hiking
And you weren't going to let a baby slow you down either. And so after Michael was born, he went on his first camping trip at 3 months old?
No, he was maybe a month old.
All right.
Maybe 5 weeks.
So this sort of being in touch with the outdoors continues, and
yeah, and the reason that we went so fast was that it was summer and I was going to need to go back to work, and Jim and I were going to share. I was going to work mornings and he would work afternoons, but we felt like we would not get a chance to go camping if we didn't do it then. So perhaps he was a little bit young, but he did fine.
He's still around. He's good.
He didn't get eaten by the bear that came into our campsite that first night. After that, we slept in the truck.
All right, and so you raised Michael in this house on this nice little street on which you still live.
Yeah, he had 5 years actually.
5 years before that, but the majority of his childhood is spent
right in that house. Yeah.
Yeah, and so you continue teaching, and you teach until about 2015, right? Is the year that you retired?
2016.
16?
Yeah.
And so, how, as a teacher, you've sort of got to see, how, as a teacher, you get kind of maybe a special insight into like the changes in how the population of an area is kind of developing, maybe. So what did you see any, what changes did you see in your 30 some odd years of teaching?
Or even, from the time I was little.
Sure.
Yeah, because I remember that even in LA, the school system that I was raised in was very white. I don't remember kids of other ethnic backgrounds in the schools that I went to, even when we moved up north. And then when I started teaching in the public schools, then I saw lots of demographic changes, but there was always a very rich ethnic groups of people. It just wasn't all. And I think that's part of one of the reasons why I wanted to travel so much too, because I just felt like there was so much in the world to see, with different cultures, and I felt like it was awfully bland, where I was living, in terms of cultures. But so I think as far as changes, I saw when I was teaching in Berkeley, it was just a very diverse classrooms that I had, with kids from India, kids, African American kids, Mexican kids. It was just very diverse. Yeah.
And you worked in this private school for about 20 years first, and that was also in Berkeley, or?
That was in Oakland.
Oakland.
Yeah.
Okay. And then you moved to public schools in Berkeley afterwards.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. And so let's see. And in your retirement, you've gotten back in touch. Well, not that you ever left, but okay. So quick correction. It was 2015 that you retired. Mm-hmm. And so, were there any other changes you wanted to talk about that you noticed? Or?
Well, it was interesting moving from private education to public schools. And I was really happy to have both experiences. Like I was very happy to live in Southern California and Northern California. But, there was a lot of freedom in the private school to, to teach in ways that I felt tapped into my strengths. And it was a little more challenging when I got into the public schools. But yet the materials available were pretty amazing, because they would spend a lot of money on different things that would enhance everybody's education. But I was really happy to come into that as a teacher who had experience in a particular type of private education. So I could, have a little more flexibility and, get the kids out for more field trips and different types of hands-on experiences. Because I felt like the other school I worked at was really heavy and hands-on experiences, and I felt like public education was trying to working towards eliminating some of those hands-on. I think they're kind of moving back into that now because they see how important that is.
Okay. So, and so in your retirement, you've been able to get more fully back into nature in your free time, and so you do go on lots of camping adventures with Jim.
Yes. We try and get out as much as possible, and we have expanded the direction that we go in. We tend to go to the desert a lot more, and instead of to the coast, we go to a place called Anza Borrego, and we just have picked up on photography and birding a lot more, so we can recognize and see what wildlife is in nature. We have spent a lot of time also in Utah. Jim has gone there by himself, and we've gone there together. Actually, I met in Nevada, where there are a lot of fossils, and fossils that you can pick up, that you're allowed to collect. And and I'm into plants too, so I kind of divide my interests in all these different areas. One of the things that both Jim and I have gotten involved in is working for an organization called GGRO, which stands for Golden Gate Raptor Organization. And it is about counting the raptors that fly from north to south. And groups of people are assigned to particular days, and we just have learned so much about raptors and identifying them and learning about how they operate. And that's kind of led into smaller birds, which has become a bit of a recent passion. And if you're thinking about small birds, you're finding small birds everywhere. They're in your backyard, no matter how small your backyard is. You walk down the street, they're everywhere. So there's a lot of them out there, so it's been fun to explore that too.
So your parents come to California, let's say post World War II, and so their reason for coming here was this
can we say the California dream? This sort of
Yeah, the mystique.
ideal. Yeah.
California dream, California mystique.
And so how is that? What a different version of that perhaps sort of has anchored you here and always kind of tethered you back to California in a way?
Well, I think, California has a lot to offer because it's so diverse in its, the landforms and the type of weather it has. So I think there are very few states that have what California has. You can drive 3 hours in one direction and get to the mountains and the snow. You can drive an hour and a half in another direction and be at the ocean. You can drive an hour into the valley and see migrating birds. You can travel a little further to the south and you can hit 3 or 4 different kinds of deserts down there. There just is a lot going on here. Oh, not to mention the redwoods, so you can drive, an hour west, and hit a beautiful forest of redwoods. And if you go to the far north of California, there are all kinds of redwood forests. And then actually in the Sierras, there is a different type of redwood that's there because you have 2 different kinds. So California has so much to offer when it comes to natural environments. And Californians are also, for the most part, intent on protecting a lot of these places. It's not so easy for builders to go in and take over. There's a lot of pushback. So I respect that because there's a lot of places that are really built up. Unfortunately, Southern California got built up, but Northern California, I think has had strong coalitions to block building. And so we have a coastline that starts, south. Well, actually, coastline that probably even starts at Santa Barbara and moves on up. And there's not a lot of big development on any of those parts, except for San Francisco, of course. We have a strong coastal commission that works to block building.
So I think a lot of Americans who don't live in California might think of California and they think of, especially when you're creeping into politics, you think of like Los Angeles and San Francisco. So a lot of Americans think. So a lot of Americans, might think of California and they think of Los Angeles and they think of San Francisco or the large metropolis of the Bay Area in general. And really that's very, geographically speaking, very small amount of California. And, given the rise we have, you might think of Silicon Valley or like the film industry when you think of California, but this sort of natural aspect that's such a draw, do you think that that's getting lost as a draw? I mean, for moving to California?
I think a lot of people want to visit California, because we have so many incredible places. Like, there's nothing like Death Valley, and there's nothing like our giant redwoods. Those don't exist in other states. And San Francisco has its own uniqueness too, but lots of cities, I think, have, a unique attraction. But I think people would like to move here, but I think more people are thinking of, in a way, of moving out because it's so expensive. they're really trying to find places that they can afford. So the American dream of owning a house and perhaps living in California is a little harder to accomplish now. And you do have a lot of people in the tech industry that are making lots of money. So it is creating some problems, in terms of, strong artist communities that we have valued in the past, can't afford to stay here and are looking for, other places. So I'm really not quite sure now about people coming to California unless they're in the tech industry and are trying to find, a job in that area. People coming to school. We have great schools in California, and people want to come and visit, that's for sure. But living here is expensive, and there are a lot of other places in the United States, I think, that people are thinking about because it's more affordable.
Is there anything that you'd like to add to what we've said here today? Anything that any aspect about your relationship with California and what it's meant to you?
Yeah, I think that California, not in all areas, but in most areas, a lot of the areas it's just a more tolerant state. And I can't say that about all areas. I mean, in the United States, there are lots of enclaves of a liberal approach. But I think California does really well in accepting a more progressive attitude towards people in their relationship, their choice of partners, their lifestyle, how they want to live. And I think that tolerance or acceptance, I don't always like the word tolerance because it means that you're tolerating it even though you don't like it. So I would say acceptance, that it's a state where there are more places where you can live and have a different lifestyle. And that might also be, culturally too. People coming here from other countries. I mean, it's always been an area where Mexican Americans have lived because they came here long time ago, and then they were working in the fields, and then they were educated and they're just part of our communities now. So I think that California tends to be an area that has a high level of acceptance, and I like living in that sort of environment.
Okay, so in talking about this California dream and the inclusivity that we're talking about that exists, certainly in the metropolitan areas of California, but even in contrast to the rest of the country, it's quite liberal, right? So this concept of the California dream, when your parents moved here, and we can acknowledge here that you're white, and so when your parents moved here at the end of World War II, they see this American dream, and at that point, it's not exactly available to everybody, right? We still have a lot of segregation going on. Civil rights hasn't happened yet, and so they have this California dream that's potentially that's accessible to them, even if they didn't have a lot of money starting out, right? Which we acknowledged earlier, but they definitely had felt that it was accessible to them and that they could achieve it. And so contrasting that with now, and the American dream is sort of getting away from us. The economy's changing, but we do have
this inclusiveness that didn't exist before. So how do you think that contrasts between when you were a kid and now?
Well, it's like I can say my parents moved here, looking for an interesting life and a life where they could raise a family and afford to raise a family. But for them personally, they had a lot of setbacks. So they had, since my father had a heart attack when I was a year old, and then he lost his job, and then my mom, who was a teacher, did not have her teaching credential. They were forced at many times during their life to barely scrape by. And yet they always had a positive outlook and never once thought about moving back to Illinois or Michigan. So Illinois was a life my mom wanted to really get away from. So I feel like they found something here, even though life was hard and they wanted to stay. And as far as, for me growing up, I always felt like I had opportunities, that I learned a lot about flexibility and not giving up, as my parents modeled. And the time when I went to school, even going to university, the tuition fees were not that much money. It was not that expensive compared to what it is now. So, I was able to have a fun life and not have a huge debt to pay off when I got out of college. So, and I think that's changing now has changed for students, because they're being priced out. It's like, I even read about students that live in their vehicle, and they go to school and write their papers in the library and maybe spend the night occasionally at a friend's house. But, it's like, it's just so darn expensive that it's really tough on kids right now. So that kind of dream of like graduating from college and having a degree and then maybe getting your master's or doctorate, it's doesn't mean like you're going to get a great job, or it might mean you might have a lot of debt that you have to pay off. So things are changing, and that's a big factor right there, in addition to the price of housing. And it just means people are getting more interesting though, with being flexible, figuring out maybe how to trade skills, going back to the way things maybe used to be many years ago. And maybe more people live in a house together, and share the costs. Or there's people get creative when they have to. But the dream as it used to be, I think, is kind of getting lost in the shuffle here.
You mentioned your brother earlier, and perhaps you mentioned he has the long hair and in the 60s and this. So how maybe a reaction or your perception of his experience with the California dream?
Well, for my brother, he did move up to Washington, but he worked for a while in California in a town called Marysville, Yuba City, and he worked with an organization that's like the Peace Corps, only it's for the United States, and it was called Vista. So he worked with a lot of underprivileged kids and had a really amazing experience with that. But he actually did not leave California because he wanted to leave California. He left because he wanted to make sure he did not get drafted, that this was not a war. The Vietnam War was not a war that he wanted to be part of. And so there was a lot of rebellion going on and a lot of demonstrations, and there were a lot of people standing up to this. But his way, I mean, he had long hair and he had an alternative lifestyle, but he was ready to move up to Canada if he had to. But he ended up settling in northern Washington near the border. But he had a lot of the local young people, the cowboys with their guns. I can remember, some nights when they'd come up and want to, what they called the squaw wrestling. And they laughed. They called him Grizzly, because he had the long hair. And they were not so accepting of the changes that were happening.
Sounds like some California frontier
yeah.
story with these names here.
Yeah, and then his girlfriend was a Chicana. She was Mexican American, and they called her squaw. They did not have any understanding of appropriate language at that time, and then they'd shoot their guns off. They come up drunk and shoot their guns off, but they managed to become friends with them enough that they didn't bother them all the time. But there was that tension up there. Stop. I forget.
All right. So, given how California is now, do you think it, at a younger stage in your life, do you think you would have, if you were living in California now, but you were younger, do you think that it would have the same draw that it did years ago, with all its changes?
Well, I think I really like where I live. There's a lot of exposure to culture and community on the street that I live on. But I think there's still a pull to something that's a little more rural, a little more quiet, a little less traffic. But in any state, any place, there are these little micro communities, if you want to call them that. And I think for me, I like California. I like the politics. I mean, there's always going to be conflicts. There's always going to be differences of opinion. There's always going to be people who are conservative and people who are more liberal. But the fact is that California, I think, has more people who are accepting, and I like living in that environment. It would be very hard for me to live in another environment where people are more closed down and have to have things a particular way. Yeah, I like California.